From Beowulf, translated and read by Burton Raffel. The selection opens during an evening of celebration at Herod, the banquet hall of the Danish king Hrothgar. Outside in the darkness, however, lurks the monster Grendel, a murderous creature who poses a great danger to the people inside the banquet hall. The Wrath of Grendel. A powerful monster, living down in the darkness, growled in pain, impatient as day after day the music rang loud in that hall, the harp's rejoicing call and the poet's clear song sung of the ancient beginnings of us all, recalling the Almighty, making the earth, shaping these beautiful plains marked off by oceans, then proudly setting the sun and moon to glow across the land and light it. The corners of the earth were made lovely with trees and leaves, made quick with life, with each of the nations who now move on its face. And then, as now, warriors sang of their pleasure. So Hrothgar's men lived happy in his hall till the monster stirred, that demon, that fiend, Grendel, who haunted the moors, the wild marshes, and made his home in a hell not hell, but earth. He was spawned in that slime, conceived by a pair of those monsters born of Cain, murderous creatures banished by God, punished forever for the crime of Abel's death. The Almighty drove those demons out, and their exile was bitter, shut away from men. They split into 1,000 forms of evil, spirits and fiends, goblins, monsters, giants, a brood forever opposing the Lord's will, and again defeated. Then, when darkness had dropped, Grendel went up to Herod, wondering what the warriors would do in that hall when their drinking was done. He found them sprawled in sleep, suspecting nothing, their dreams undisturbed. The monster's thoughts were as quick as his greed or his claws. He slipped through the door, and there in the silence snatched up 30 men, smashed them unknowing in their beds, and ran out with their bodies, the blood dripping behind him, back to his lair, delighted with his night's slaughter. At daybreak, with the sun's first light, they saw how well he had worked, and in that grey morning broke their long feast, with tears and laments for the dead. Hrothgar, their lord, sat joyless in Herod, a mighty prince, mourning the fate of his lost friends and companions, knowing by its tracks that some demon had torn his followers apart. He wept, fearing the beginning might not be the end. And that night Grendel came again, so set on murder that no crime could ever be enough, no savage assault quench his lust for evil. Then each warrior tried to escape him, searched for rest in different beds as far from Herod as they could find, seeing how Grendel hunted when they slept. Distance was safety. The only survivors were those who fled him. Hate had triumphed. So Grendel ruled, fought with the righteous, one against many, and won. So Herod stood empty and stayed deserted for years, 12 winters of grief for Hrothgar, king of the Danes, sorrow heaped at his door by hell-forged hands. His misery leapt the seas, was told and sung in all men's ears, how Grendel's hatred began, how the monster relished his savage war on the Danes, keeping the bloody feud alive, seeking no peace, offering no truce, accepting no settlement, no price in gold or land, and paying the living for one crime only with another. No one waited for reparation from his plundering claws. That shadow of death hunted in the darkness, stalked Hrothgar's warriors, old and young, lying in waiting, hidden in mist, invisibly following them from the edge of the marsh, always there, unseen. So mankind's enemy continued his crimes, killing as often as he could, coming alone, bloodthirsty and horrible. Though he lived in Herod when the night hid him, he never dared to touch King Hrothgar's glorious throne, protected by God. God whose love Grendel could not know. But Hrothgar's heart was bent. The best and most noble of his council debated remedies, sat in secret sessions talking of terror and wondering what the bravest of warriors could do. And sometimes they sacrificed to the old stone gods, made heathen vows, hoping for hell's support, the devil's guidance in driving their affliction off. That was their way, and the heathens' only hope, hell always in their hearts, knowing neither God nor his passing as he walks through our world, the Lord of heaven and earth. Their ears could not hear his praise, nor know his glory. Let them beware those who are thrust into danger, clutched at by trouble, yet can carry no solace in their hearts, cannot hope to be better. Hail to those who will rise to God, drop off their dead bodies, and seek our Father's peace. The coming of Beowulf. So the living sorrow of Healfdene's son simmered bitter and fresh, and no wisdom or strength could break it. That agony hung on king and people alike, harsh and unending, violent and cruel and evil. In his far-off home, Beowulf, Hygelac's follower and the strongest of the Geats, greater and stronger than anyone anywhere in this world, heard how Grendel filled knights with horror and quickly commanded a boat fitted out, proclaiming that he'd go to that famous king, would sail across the sea to Hrothgar now when help was needed. None of the wise ones regretted his going, much as he was loved by the Geats. The omens were good, and they urged the adventure on. So Beowulf chose the mightiest men he could find, the bravest and best of the Geats, 14 in all, and led them down to their boat. He knew the sea, would point the prow straight to that distant Danish shore. Then they sailed, set their ship out on the waves under the cliffs. Ready for what came, they wound through the currents, the seas beating at the sand, and were borne in the lap of their shining ship, lined with gleaming armor, going safely in that oak-hard boat to where their hearts took them. The wind hurried them over the waves, the ship foamed through the sea like a bird until, in the time they had known it would take, standing in the round-curled prow, they could see sparkling hills high and green jutting up over the shore, and rejoicing in those rock-steep cliffs, they quietly ended their voyage. Jumping to the ground, the Geats pushed their boat to the sand and tied it in place, mail-shirts and armor rattling as they swiftly moored their ship. And then they gave thanks to God for their easy crossing. High on a wall, a Danish watcher patrolling along the cliffs saw the travelers crossing to the shore, their shields raised and shining. He came riding down, Hrothgar's lieutenant, spurring his horse, needing to know why they'd landed these men in armor. Shaking his heavy spear in their faces, he spoke. "Whose soldiers are you, you who've been carried in your deep-keeled ship across the sea road to this country of mine? Listen, I've stood on these cliffs longer than you know, keeping our coast free of pirates, raiders sneaking ashore from their ships, seeking our lives and our gold. None have ever come more openly, and yet you've offered no password, no sign from my prince, no permission from my people for your landing here, nor have I ever seen, out of all the men on earth, one greater than has come with you. No commoner carries such weapons, unless his appearance and his beauty are both lies. You, tell me your name and your father's. No spies go further onto Danish soil than you've come already. Strangers, from wherever it was you sailed, tell it, and tell it quickly. The quicker the better, I say, for us all. Speak, say exactly who you are, and from where, and why." Their leader answered him, Beowulf, unlocking words from deep in his breast. "We are Geats, men who follow Hygelac. My father was a famous soldier, known far and wide as a leader of men. His name was Ecgtheow. His life lasted many winters. Wise men all over the earth surely remember him still. And we have come seeking your prince, Healfdene's son, protector of this people, only in friendship. Instruct us, watchman. Help us with your words. Our errand is a great one, our business with the glorious king of the Danes no secret. There's nothing dark or hidden in our coming. You know, if we've heard the truth and been told honestly, that your country is cursed with some strange, vicious creature that hunts only at night, and that no one has seen. It's said, watchman, that he has slaughtered your people, brought terror to the darkness. Perhaps Hrothgar can hunt here in my heart for some way to drive this devil out, if anything will ever end the evils afflicting your wise and famous lord. Here he can cool his burning sorrow, or else he may see his suffering go on forever, for as long as Heorot towers high on your hills. The mounted officer answered him bluntly, the brave watchman. A soldier should know the difference between words and deeds and keep that knowledge clear in his brain. I believe your words. I trust in your friendship. Go forward, weapons and armor and all, on into Denmark. I'll guide you myself, and my men will guard your ship. Keep it safe here on our shores, your fresh-tarred boat. Watch it well until that curving prow carries across the sea to Geatland, a chosen warrior who bravely does battle with the creature haunting our people, who survives that horror unhurt, and goes home bearing our love. Then they moved on. Their boat lay moored, tied tight to its anchor. Glittering at the top of their golden helmets, wild boar heads gleamed, shining decorations swinging as they marched, erect, like guards, like sentinels, as though ready to fight. They marched, Beowulf and his men and their guide, until they could see the gables of Heorot, covered with hammered gold and glowing in the sun, that most famous of all dwellings, towering majestic, its glittering roofs visible far across the land. Their guide reined in his horse, pointing to that hall built by Hrothgar for the best and bravest of his men. The path was plain. They could see their way. Beowulf and his men arrive at Heorot and are about to be escorted in to see King Hrothgar. Beowulf arose with his men around him, ordering a few to remain with their weapons, leading the others quickly along under Heorot's steep roof into Hrothgar's presence. Standing on that prince's own hearth, helmeted, the silvery metal of his mail shirt gleaming with a smith's high art, he greeted the Danes' great lord. "Hail, Hrothgar! Hygelac is my cousin and my king. The days of my youth have been filled with glory. Now Grendel's name has echoed in our land. Sailors have brought us stories of Heorot, the best of all mead halls, deserted and useless when the moon hangs in skies the sun had lit, light and life fleeing together. My people have said, the wisest, most knowing and best of them, that my duty was to go to the Danes' great king. They have seen my strength for themselves, have watched me rise from the darkness of war, dripping with my enemy's blood. I drove 5 great giants into chains, chased all of that race from the earth. I swam in the blackness of night, hunting monsters out of the ocean and killing them one by one. Death was my errand, and the fate they had earned. Now Grendel and I are called together, and I've come. Grant me then, Lord and protector of this noble place, a single request. I have come so far, O shelterer of warriors, and your people's loved friend, that this one favor you should not refuse me, that I, alone, and with the help of my men, may purge all evil from this hall. I have heard, too, that the monster's scorn of men is so great that he needs no weapons and fears none. Nor will I. My lord Hygelac might think less of me if I let my sword go where my feet were afraid to, if I hid behind some broad linden shield. My hands alone shall fight for me, struggle for life against the monster. God must decide who will be given to death's cold grip. Grendel's plan, I think, will be what it has been before, to invade this hall and gorge his belly with our bodies. If he can. If he can. And I think, if my time will have come, there'll be nothing to mourn over, no corpse to prepare for its grave. Grendel will carry our bloody flesh to the moors, crunch on our bones, and smear torn scraps of our skin on the walls of his den. Now, I expect no Danes will fret about sewing our shrouds, if he wins. And if death does take me, send the hammered mail of my armor to Hygelac, return the inheritance I had from Hrethel, and he from Wayland. Fate will unwind as it must. The battle with Grendel. That night Beowulf and his men take the places of Hrothgar and the Danes inside Heorot. While his men sleep, Beowulf lies awake, eager to meet with Grendel. Out from the marsh, from the foot of misty hills and bogs, bearing God's hatred, Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone he could trap on this trip to High Heorot. He moved quickly through the cloudy night, up from his swampland, sliding silently toward that gold-shining hall. He had visited Hrothgar's home before, knew the way, but never before nor after that night found Heorot defended so firmly, his reception so harsh. He journeyed, forever joyless, straight to the door, then snapped it open, tore its iron fastenings with a touch, and rushed angrily over the threshold. He strode quickly across the inlaid floor, snarling and fierce. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, burned with a gruesome light. Then he stopped, seeing the hall crowded with sleeping warriors, stuffed with rows of young soldiers resting together, and his heart laughed. He relished the sight, intended to tear the life from those bodies by morning. The monster's mind was hot with the thought of food and the feasting his belly would soon know. But fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. Human eyes were watching his evil steps, waiting to see his swift, hard claws. Grendel snatched at the first geat he came to, ripped him apart, cut his body to bits with powerful jaws, drank the blood from his veins, and bolted him down hands and feet. Death and Grendel's great teeth came together, snapping life shut. Then he stepped to another still body, clutched at Beowulf with his claws, grasped at a strong-hearted, wakeful sleeper, and was instantly seized himself, claws bent back as Beowulf leaned up on one arm. That shepherd of evil, guardian of crime, knew at once that nowhere on earth had he met a man whose hands were harder. His mind was flooded with fear, but nothing could take his talons and himself from that tight, hard grip. Grendel's one thought was to run from Beowulf, flee back to his marsh, and hide there. This was a different Heorot than the hall he had emptied. But Hygelac's follower remembered his final boast, and standing erect, stopped the monster's flight, fastened those claws in his fists till they cracked, clutched Grendel closer. The infamous killer fought for his freedom, wanting no flesh but retreat, desiring nothing but escape. His claws had been caught. He was trapped. That trip to Heorot was a miserable journey for the writhing monster. The high hall rang, its roof boards swayed, and the Danes shook with terror. Down the aisles the battle swept, angry and wild. Heorot trembled, wonderfully built to withstand the blows, the struggling great bodies beating at its beautiful walls. Shaped and fastened with iron inside and out, artfully worked, the building stood firm. Its benches rattled, fell to the floor, gold-covered boards grating as Grendel and Beowulf battled across them. Hrothgar's wise men had fashioned Heorot to stand forever. Only fire, they had planned, could shatter what such skill had put together, swallow in hot flames such splendor of ivory and iron and wood. Suddenly the sounds changed. The Danes started in new terror, cowering in their beds as the terrible screams of the Almighty's enemies sang in the darkness, the horrible shrieks of pain and defeat, the tears torn out of Grendel's taut throat, Hel's captive caught in the arms of him who of all the men on earth was the strongest. That mighty protector of men meant to hold the monster till its life leaped out, knowing the fiend was no use to anyone in Denmark. All of Beowulf's band had jumped from their beds, ancestral swords raised and ready, determined to protect their prince if they could. Their courage was great, but all wasted. They could hack at Grendel from every side, trying to open a path for his evil soul, but their points could not hurt him. The sharpest and hardest iron could not scratch at his skin, for that sin-stained demon had bewitched all men's weapons, laid spells that blunted every mortal man's blade. And yet his time had come. His days were over, his death near. Down to hell he would go, swept groaning and helpless to the waiting hands of still worse fiends. Now he discovered, once the afflicter of men, tormentor of their days, what it meant to feud with Almighty God. Grendel saw that his strength was deserting him, his claws bound fast, Hygelac's brave follower tearing at his hands. The monster's hatred rose higher, but his power had gone. He twisted in pain, and the bleeding sinews deep in his shoulder snapped, muscle and bones split and broke. The battle was over. Beowulf had been granted new glory. Grendel escaped, but wounded as he was, could flee to his den, his miserable hole at the bottom of the marsh, only to die, to wait for the end of all his days. And after that bloody combat, the Danes laughed with delight. He who had come to them from across the sea, bold and strong-minded, had driven affliction off, purged Herit clean. He was happy now with that night's fierce work. The Danes had been served as he'd boasted he'd served them. Beowulf, a prince of the Geats, had killed Grendel, ended the grief, the sorrow, the suffering forced on Hrothgar's helpless people by a bloodthirsty fiend. No Dane doubted the victory, for the proof, hanging high from the rafters where Beowulf had hung it, was the monster's arm, claw, and shoulder, and all. Hrothgar and his host celebrate Beowulf's victory over the monster Grendel. That night, however, Grendel's mother kidnaps and kills Hrothgar's closest friend and carries off the claw that Beowulf tore from her child. The next day, the horrified king tells Beowulf about the two monsters and their underwater lair. The monster's lair. I've heard that my people, peasants working in the fields, have seen a pair of such fiends wandering in the moors and the marshes, giant monsters living in those desert lands. And they've said to my wise men that, as well as they could see, one of the devils was a female creature. The other, they say, walked through the wilderness like a man, but mightier than any man. They were frightened, and they fled, hoping to find help in Herit. They named the huge one Grendel. If he had a father, no one knew him, or whether there'd been others before these two. Hidden evil before hidden evil. They live in secret places, windy cliffs, wolf dens where water pours from the rocks, then runs underground, where mist steams like black clouds, and the groves of trees growing out over their lake are all covered with frozen spray, and wind down snake-like roots that reach as far as the water and help keep it dark. At night, that lake burns like a torch. No one knows its bottom. No wisdom reaches such depths. A deer hunted through the woods by packs of hounds, a stag with great horns, though driven through the forest from faraway places, prefers to die on those shores, refuses to save its life in that water. It isn't far nor is it a pleasant spot. When the wind stirs and storms, waves splash toward the sky, as dark as the air, as black as the rain, let the heavens weep. Our only help, again, lies with you. Grendel's mother is hidden in her terrible home, in a place you've not seen. Seek it, if you dare. Save us once more, and again twisted gold, heaped up ancient treasure will reward you for the battle you win. The battle with Grendel's mother. Beowulf resolves to kill the lady monster. Arriving at the lake under which she lives, Beowulf and his companions see serpents in the water and sea beasts on the rocks. The young hero kills one of the beasts with an arrow and then prepares to fight Grendel's mother. Then Ecgtheow's brave son spoke. Remember, Hrothgar, O knowing king, now when my danger is near, the warm words we uttered, and if your enemy should end my life, then be, O generous prince, forever the father and protector of all whom I leave behind me here in your hands, my beloved comrades left with no leader, their leader dead. And the precious gifts you gave me, my friend, send them to Hygelac. May he see in their golden brightness, the Geats' great lord, gazing at your treasure, that here in Denmark I found a noble protector, a giver of rings whose rewards I won and briefly relished. And you, Unferth, let my famous old sword stay in your hands. I shall shape glory with Hrunting, or death will hurry me from this earth. As his words ended, he leapt into the lake, would not wait for anyone's answer. The heaving water covered him over. For hours he sank through the waves. At last he saw the mud of the bottom. And all at once the greedy she-wolf who'd ruled those waters for 500 years discovered him, saw that a creature from above had come to explore the bottom of her wet world. She welcomed him in her claws, clutched at him savagely but could not harm him, tried to work her fingers through the tight ring-woven mail on his breast, but tore and scratched in vain. Then she carried him, armor and sword and all, to her home. He struggled to free his weapon and failed. The fight brought other monsters swimming to see her catch, a host of sea beasts who beat at his mail shirt, stabbing with tusks and teeth as they followed along. Then he realized suddenly that she'd brought him into someone's battle hall, and there the water's heat could not hurt him, nor anything in the lake attack him through the building's high arching roof. A brilliant light burned all around him, the lake itself like a fiery flame. Then he saw the mighty water witch, and swung his sword, his ring-marked blade, straight at her head. The iron sang its fierce song, sang Beowulf's strength. But her guest discovered that no sword could slice her evil skin, that hunting could not hurt her, was useless now when he needed it. They wrestled. She ripped and tore and clawed at him, bit holes in his helmet, and that too failed him. For the first time in years of being worn to war, it would earn no glory. It was the last time anyone would wear it. But Beowulf longed only for fame, leapt back into battle. He tossed his sword aside, angry. The steel-edged blade lay where he'd dropped it. If weapons were useless, he'd use his hands, the strength in his fingers. So fame comes to the men who mean to win it and care about nothing else. He raised his arms and seized her by the shoulder. Anger doubled his strength. He threw her to the floor. She fell, Grendel's fierce mother, and the Geats' proud prince was ready to leap on her, but she rose at once and repaid him with her clutching claws, wildly tearing at him. He was weary, that best and strongest of soldiers. His feet stumbled, and in an instant she had him down, held helpless. Squatting with her weight on his stomach, she drew a dagger, brown with dried blood, and prepared to avenge her only son. But he was stretched on his back, and her stabbing blade was blunted by the woven mail shirt he wore on his chest. The hammered links held. The point could not touch him. He'd have travelled to the bottom of the earth, Edgeso's son, and died there, if that shining woven metal had not helped. And holy God, who sent him victory, gave judgment for truth and right, ruler of the heavens. Once Beowulf was back on his feet and fighting. Then he saw hanging on the wall a heavy sword hammered by giants, strong and blessed with their magic, the best of all weapons, but so massive that no ordinary man could lift its carved and decorated length. He drew it from its scabbard, broke the chain on its hilt, and then, savage now, angry and desperate, lifted it high over his head and struck with all the strength he had left, caught her in the neck, and cut it through, broke bones and all. Her body fell to the floor, lifeless. The sword was wet with her blood, and Beowulf rejoiced at the sight. The brilliant light shone suddenly as though burning in that hall, and as bright as heaven's own candle lit in the sky. He looked at her home, then following along the wall went walking, his hands tight on the sword, his heart still angry. He was hunting another dead monster, and took his weapon with him for final revenge against Grendel's vicious attacks, his nighttime raids, over and over, coming to Heorot when Hrothgar's men slept, killing them in their beds, eating some on the spot, 15 or more, and running to his loathsome moor with another such sickening meal waiting in his pouch. But Beowulf repaid him for those visits, found him lying dead in his corner, armless, exactly as that fierce fighter had sent him out from Heorot, then struck off his head with a single swift blow. The body jerked for the last time, then lay still. The wise old warriors who surrounded Hrothgar, like him staring into the monster's lake, saw the waves surging and blood spurting through. They spoke about Beowulf, all the greybeards, whispered together and said that hope was gone, that the hero had lost fame and his life at once, and would never return to the living, come back as triumphant as he had left. Almost all agreed that Grendel's mighty mother, the she-wolf, had killed him. The sun slid over past noon, went further down. The Danes gave up, left the lake, and went home, Hrothgar with them. The Geats stayed, sat sadly, watching, imagining they saw their lord, but not believing they would ever see him again. Then the sword melted, blood-soaked, dripping down like water, disappearing like ice when the world's eternal Lord loosens invisible fetters and unwinds icicles and frost as only he can, he who rules time and seasons, he who is truly God. The monster's hall was full of rich treasures, but all that Beowulf took was Grendel's head and the hilt of the giant's jeweled sword. The rest of that ring-marked blade had dissolved in Grendel's steaming blood, boiling even after his death. And then the battle's only survivor swam up and away from those silent corpses. The water was calm and clean, the whole huge lake peaceful once the demons who'd lived in it were dead. Then that noble protector of all seamen swam to land, rejoicing in the heavy burdens he was bringing with him. He and all his glorious band of Geats thanked God that their leader had come back unharmed. They left the lake together. The Geats carried Beowulf's helmet and his mail shirt. Behind them, the water slowly thickened as the monster's blood came seeping up. They walked quickly, happily, across roads all of them remembered, left the lake and the cliffs alongside it, brave men staggering under the weight of Grendel's skull, too heavy for fewer than 4 of them to handle, 2 on each side of the spear jammed through it, yet proud of their ugly load and determined that the Danes seated in Heorot should see it. Soon 14 Geats arrived at the hall, bold and warlike, and with Beowulf, their lord and leader, they walked on the mead hall green. Then the Geats' brave prince entered Heorot, covered with glory for the daring battles he had fought. He sought Hrothgar to salute him and show Grendel's head. He carried that terrible trophy by the hair, brought it straight to where the Danes sat, drinking, the queen among them. It was a weird and wonderful sight, and the warriors stared. The last battle. After being honored by Hrothgar, Beowulf and his fellow Geats return home. He's welcomed by the king, his uncle Hygelac, and later becomes king himself when Hygelac and his son have died. Beowulf rules Geatland for 50 years. Then a dragon menaces his kingdom. Although he's an old man, Beowulf determines to slay the beast. Before going into battle, he tells the men who have accompanied him about the history of the royal house and his exploits in its service. And Beowulf uttered his final boast. "I've never known fear. As a youth, I fought in endless battles. I'm old now, but I'll fight again. Seek fame still, if the dragon, hiding in his tower, dares to face me." And he said farewell to his followers, each in his turn for the last time. "I'd use no sword, no weapon, if this beast could be killed without it, crushed to death like Grendel, gripped in my hands and torn limb from limb. But his breath will be burning hot, poison will pour from his tongue. I feel no shame with shield and sword and armor against this monster. When he comes to me, I mean to stand, not run from his shooting flames. Stand till fate decides which of us wins. My heart is firm, my hands calm. I need no hot words. Wait for me close by, my friends. We shall see soon who will survive this bloody battle, stand when the fighting is done. No one else could do what I mean to here. No man but me could hope to defeat this monster. No one could try. And this dragon's treasure, his gold and everything hidden in that tower, will be mine, or war will sweep me to a bitter death." And Beowulf rose, still brave, still strong, and with his shield at his side and a mail shirt on his breast, strode calmly, confidently, toward the tower, under the rocky cliffs. No coward could have walked there. And then he who had endured dozens of desperate battles, who'd stood boldly while swords and shields clashed, the best of kings, saw huge stone arches and felt the heat of the dragon's breath flooding down through the hidden entrance, too hot for anyone to stand, a streaming current of fire and smoke that blocked all passage. And the Geats' lord and leader, angry, lowered his sword and roared out a battle cry, a call so loud and clear that it reached through the hoary rock, hung in the dragon's ear. The beast rose angry, knowing a man had come, and then nothing but war could have followed. Its breath came first, a steaming cloud pouring from the stone. Then the earth itself shook. Beowulf swung his shield into place, held it in front of him facing the entrance. The dragon coiled and uncoiled its heart, urging it into battle. Beowulf's ancient sword was waiting, unsheathed, his sharp and gleaming blade. The beast came closer. Both of them were ready, each set on slaughter. The Geats' great prince stood firm, unmoving, prepared behind his high shield, waiting in his shining armor. The monster came quickly toward him, pouring out fire and smoke, hurrying to its fate. Flames beat at the iron shield, and for a time it held, protected Beowulf as he'd planned. Then it began to melt, and for the first time in his life that famous prince fought with fate against him, with glory denied him. He knew it, but he raised his sword and struck at the dragon's scaly hide. The ancient blade broke, bit into the monster's skin, drew blood, but cracked and failed him before it went deep enough, helped him less than he needed. The dragon leapt with pain, thrashed and beat at him, spouting murderous flames, spreading them everywhere. And the Geats' ring-giver did not boast of glorious victories in other wars. His weapon had failed him, deserted him now when he needed it most. That excellent sword. Edgethow's famous son stared at death, unwilling to leave this world, to exchange it for a dwelling in some distant place, a journey into darkness that all men must make as death ends their few brief hours on earth. Quickly the dragon came at him, encouraged as Beowulf fell back. Its breath flared, and he suffered, wrapped around in swirling flames, a king before, but now a beaten warrior. None of his comrades came to him, helped him, his brave and noble followers. They ran for their lives, fled deep in a wood, and only one of them remained, stood there miserable, remembering as a good man must what kinship should mean. His name was Wiglaf. He was Wexton's son and a good soldier. His family had been Swedish once. Watching Beowulf, he could see how his king was suffering, burning, and remembering everything his lord and cousin had given him, armor and gold and the great estates Wexton's family enjoyed. Wiglaf's mind was made up. He raised his yellow shield and drew his sword, an ancient weapon that had once belonged to Ornella's nephew, and that Wexton had won, killing the prince when he fled from Sweden, sought safety with Herdred, and found death. And Wiglaf's father had carried the dead man's armor and his sword to Ornella, and the king had said nothing, only given him armor and sword and all, everything his rebel nephew had owned and lost when he left this life. And Wexton had kept those shining gifts, held them for years, waiting for his son to use them, wear them as honorably and well as once his father had done. Then Wexton died, and Wiglaf was his heir, inherited treasures and weapons and land. He'd never worn that armor, fought with that sword, until Beowulf called him to his side, led him into war. But his soul did not melt. His sword was strong. The dragon discovered his courage and his weapon when the rush of battle brought them together. And Wiglaf, his heart heavy, uttered the kind of words his comrades deserved. I remember how we sat in the mead hall, drinking and boasting of how brave we'd be when Beowulf needed us, he who gave us these swords and armor. All of us swore to repay him when the time came, kindness for kindness, with our lives if he needed them. He allowed us to join him, chose us from all his great army, thinking our boasting words had some weight, believing our promises, trusting our swords. He took us for soldiers, for men. He meant to kill this monster himself, our mighty king, fight this battle alone and unaided, as in the days when his strength and daring dazzled men's eyes. But those days are over and gone, and now our Lord must lean on younger arms, and we must go to him while angry flames burn at his flesh. Help our glorious king. By Almighty God, I'd rather burn myself than see flames swirling around my Lord. And who are we to carry home our shields before we've slain his enemy and ours, to run back to our homes with Beowulf so hard-pressed here? I swear that nothing he ever did deserved an end like this, dying miserably and alone, butchered by this savage beast. We swore that these swords and armor were each for us all. Then he ran to his king, crying encouragement as he drove through the dragon's deadly fumes. The spoils. Together Wiglaf and Beowulf kill the dragon, but the old king is mortally wounded. As a last request, Beowulf asks Wiglaf to bring him the treasure that the dragon was guarding. Then Wexton's son went in as quickly as he could, did as the dying Beowulf asked, entered the inner darkness of the tower, went with his mail shirt and his sword. Flushed with victory, he groped his way, a brave young warrior, and suddenly saw piles of gleaming gold, precious gems scattered on the floor, cups and bracelets, rustly old helmets, beautifully made but rotting with no hands to rub and polish them. They lay where the dragon had left them. It had flown in the darkness once before fighting its final battle. So gold can easily triumph, defeat the strongest of men, no matter how deep it is hidden. And he saw hanging high above a golden banner, woven by the best of weavers and beautiful. And over everything he saw a strange light shining everywhere, on walls and floor and treasure. Nothing moved. No other monsters appeared. He took what he wanted, all the treasures that pleased his eye, heavy plates and golden cups and the glorious banner, loaded his arms with all they could hold. Beowulf's dagger, his iron blade, had finished the fire-spitting terror that once protected tower and treasures alike. The gray-bearded lord of the Geats had ended those flying, burning raids forever. Then Wiglaf went back, anxious to return while Beowulf was alive, to bring him treasure they'd won together. He ran, hoping his wounded king, weak and dying, had not left the world too soon. Then he brought their treasure to Beowulf, and found his famous king bloody, gasping for breath. But Wiglaf sprinkled water over his lord, until the words deep in his breast broke through and were heard. Beholding the treasure, he spoke, haltingly. For this gold, these jewels, I thank our Father in heaven, ruler of the earth, for all of this that his grace has given me, allowed me to bring to my people while breath still came to my lips. I sold my life for this treasure, and I sold it well. Take what I leave, Wiglaf. Lead my people. Help them. My time is gone. Have the brave Geats build me a tomb when the funeral flames have burned me, and build it here at the water's edge, high on this spit of land, so sailors can see this tower and remember my name, and call it Beowulf's Tower, and boats in the darkness and mist crossing the sea will know it. Then that brave king gave the golden necklace from around his throat to Wiglaf, gave him his gold-covered helmet and his rings and his mail shirt, and ordered him to use them well. You're the last of all our far-flung family. Fate has swept our race away, taken the warriors and their strength, and led them to the death that was waiting. And now I follow them. The old man's mouth was silent, spoke no more, had said as much as it could. He would sleep in the fire soon. His soul left his flesh, flew to glory. The farewell. Then the Geats built the tower as Beowulf had asked, strong and tall, so sailors could find it from far and wide. Working for 10 long days, they made his monument, sealed his ashes in walls as straight and high as wise and willing hands could raise them. And the riches he and Wiglaf had won from the dragon, rings, necklaces, ancient hammered armor, all the treasures they'd taken, were left there too. Silver and jewels buried in the sandy ground, back in the earth, again and forever, hidden and useless to men. And then 12 of the bravest Geats rode their horses around the tower, telling their sorrow, telling stories of their dead king and his greatness, his glory, praising him for heroic deeds, for a life as noble as his name. So should all men raise up words for their lords, warm with love, when their shield and protector leaves his body behind, sends his soul on high. And so Beowulf's followers rode, mourning their beloved leader, crying that no better king had ever lived, no prince so mild, no man so open to his people, so deserving of praise.